I'm excited for today because we get to jump back into Ephesians. So hold your place. So we have Ephesians 4 and Matthew 21. Those are two spots. I have an unenviable task this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, and that is because we've taken such a break from Ephesians and because we were going through this verse by verse study, and there's even some in here that weren't with us for all of Ephesians, and we're now in chapter 4. We spent the first year of our existence going through the book of Ephesians, and I have the unenviable task of trying to recap that for us. And I say unenviable only because there's so much theology inside of this book. I would recommend it to anybody in this room, especially to read the book of Ephesians often. Only because, and maybe primarily because it is a book that has so much rich theology about our stances before God, our setting before God, who we were, and then what He did in Christ. It's a critical book in terms of theology for the New Covenant era, the one that we live in. So I want to try to take us through really quickly. We're going to be in 425, but again, that's past the midway point. So I want to just try to do a quick recap, okay? So I don't plan on doing this justice. I want to try to just give us the 30,000-foot view and remind us, maybe be a pointer of a couple of things, and we'll kind of take it chapter by chapter. So how do you do that without spending 5 hours here with us? I think I'm just going to try it with 3 different approaches here. We're just going to do the who, the where, and the what of Ephesians and try and get the overall view before we jump into 425, okay? Who? There are 2 main who's in the book of Ephesians. That would be Paul, and that would be the saints at Ephesus. So let's start with Paul. The fact that, this is what we spoke of before, the fact that Paul is writing this book is unthinkable in the first century. Now, again, this is largely lost on us. Largely lost that it's Paul writing this. In the first century, this was a scandal. This would have been a huge hurdle that you can't get past. This is Paul, the one who's hunting down Christians, right? This is Paul who's dragging them from their homes, separating families, throwing people into jail. He was present and affirming of executions. This is Paul. This is Paul who was not only skeptical about Christ, but did everything he could. He was obsessed with destroying anyone and anything that was associated with Christ. This is Paul. He traveled miles to crush the movement that proclaimed Christ as Lord. And yet now here he is, and it starts in chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, the one who used to crush that movement, is now an apostle of Christ Jesus. We read that and we go, of course he is. Because we have 20 centuries at our back. We don't think about these things. If you could transport back into the first century, this would be unthinkable. Paul is doing this. This is a full display of God's sovereignty and of His grace. The fact that Paul is writing this letter. That's the first who. Second who would be the saints of Ephesus. Now be reminded, it's critical for us to be reminded that as we look at this book, it is written to Christians, saints in Ephesus, right? The whole point of this book is Paul is directly addressing people that have already been called by God. The people of God have special privileges that the world doesn't have. Namely, they've been chosen by God to be called out of darkness. Paul's going to unpack this whole letter about God's sovereign call. By the way, God has always reserved a people for Himself. I think a lot of people have trouble right here. But listen, God's always done this. From the beginning, you want to read the entire Old Testament? God has always had a particular people reserved for Himself. Always. He made specific covenants with people. He never did open-ended covenants. He always did specific covenants. Called Noah, called Abraham, called Moses. He called a nation out of the nations. He's always had specific covenants. Why would we think in the new covenant that it's any different? Paul is arguing here and speaking to the saints that God has called. And if you are a Christian in this room today, please hear me. If you're a Christian in this room today, you have been given a blessing that is nearly impossible to calculate. You have been given a blessing. You've been called out of darkness, and God does that for his people. Jesus paid for that people on the cross with his very blood. So that's the who, Paul and the saints. Keep these things in mind. Let's go to the where. Ephesus falls flat on a lot of us. We maybe have heard the term, but we don't know anything about it in terms of any kind of depth. Modern day Turkey today, we could go to Ephesus. By the way, I was not in that area. That's one of the only few places in the Bible I haven't been, which is, I would love to go. I've heard incredible things about it. The amphitheater that Paul was persecuted in is still there. And so you can walk in those stones, would be incredible. Modern day Turkey. But Ephesus was a port city and a very strategic city because it was a go-between. It was this port city in between trade routes between Europe and Asia. And so whatever takes root in Ephesus has the potential to go far and wide across the entire Roman Empire. Very strategic city. It's not by accident that God called one of his churches to be in that city. And though it's likely that Paul didn't plant that church, he was very foundational in that church. Case in point, we're reading his letter. We are reading his letter 2,000 years later to these people from back then. Okay? So, very strategic place. That would be the where. Let's do the what. Now, this is the hard part. The who and the what are the easier, the who and the where are the easier parts. The what becomes a little more challenging. And so, because we have, verses after verse after verse, how do we unpack this? Well, I'm going to take it by chapters. That's my thought here. I'll give you just a general overview. Let's take chapter 1. One of the ways that you could summarize chapter 1 of Ephesians would be that God's sovereignty in salvation. God is sovereign in salvation. We have this entire work where Paul's going to unpack God's sovereign work in salvation. He's going to do it from three ways: election, predestination, and then redemption. Look at chapter 1, verses 4 through 7, where he's going to unpack these things. He says this: even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace with which he has blessed us in the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace. Paul is marveling here. He's marveling that you are chosen by God before the foundation of the world. He's marveling here that you have been predestined for adoption. You know what I'm saying? We've talked about this from the idea of the mutiny in the Garden of Eden. We were traitors to God, and God took those traitors and he made them sons and daughters. Paul's marveling at these things. He's marveling that we are redeemed through God's blood, and then we're given an inheritance. We don't deserve any of this. Paul's marveling at these things. These are biblical truths not to be fought over. I see so many people that just want to fight over these things. Not to be fought over. I think the point of what Paul is arguing here in Ephesians is that these kinds of doctrines, these kind of real deep, theological teaching are supposed to close our mouths and make us in awe. We're supposed to marvel like Paul's marveling, in awe of what God has done, what he's doing, to grasp the majesty that God took wretched sinners who are in Adam, a part of the mutiny, and he made them sons and daughters. Who does that? Nobody does that. They're not meant to be topics of debate. These are meant to be topics that inspire awe and close our mouths. It's chapter 1. Chapter 2 could be summarized by saying salvation is by grace alone. Now, Paul shifts his discussion from election and he goes into personal regeneration. In other words, being made new. How did you become saved? You ever thought about these questions instead of just saying, what our culture says? How did you become saved? Paul first, in chapter 2, describes our status. Right? I love it how honest he is, right? He says it in verse 1, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now at work in the sons of disobedience. You were dead, but why use that language? He didn't have to say it that way. Could have just taken it from the Jesus route. He could have taken it from any kind of route, but he went through dead first. He's going to talk to you about your status. Why? I want to know these things, right? When I try to engage with the text, I want to say, why did you do it this way? What argument are you unfolding in front of us here? He went through the dead route. You are dead. In other words, you did nothing to contribute to bring about your salvation. This is his argument. You were unable to respond to God. Why? Because dead people can't do anything. This is the point. You can't do anything. And why would he say it like this? Because this idea eats away at our pride. We love pride. I love to think that I did a thing. I want to at least take part in something. I want to say, God went this far, but I did the other, right? Our culture loves to have this idea that God made it possible, but I had to be the decider, the deciding vote. It's not true. It's not true. It's not from Ephesians. You can't make that case from Ephesians at all. He said, you're dead. I was dead. God had to make me alive. Now listen, let's read 2, 1 through 5 really quickly. We already read 1 and 2. Let me do it again. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you've been saved. And he raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Do you see what's happened here? Because of his incredible mercy. This is what he wants you to see, the incredible mercy. He made us alive in Christ. Grace was a gift, but also faith. Faith and grace were a gift from God. And that's how God made you alive. Why? Because he wants to remove any potential that you could boast at all. You have no part in this. Why? Because you were dead. You were dead. You had to be made alive. This is the idea of the Lazarus story, right? Switch over in our minds really quickly to the Gospel of John. If you remember the story, John chapter 11, Lazarus is sick. Jesus says, let's wait. Why? Because I'm not going to go there when he's sick. I'm going to go there when he's dead. Jesus intentionally waits so that Lazarus will die. Why? He's going to go there and he's going to give us a picture of salvation. He's going to give us a picture of the gospel. What's that picture? Lazarus got to play a part. Now think about this. He unfortunately has to die twice in this world, but he got to play a part in this drama that is salvation. What was the part? That Lazarus was in the tomb. Jesus goes to the tomb and he says, Lazarus, come forth. The question I would have for us is, what part did Lazarus play in his resurrection? Zero. He's the dead guy. He's the dead guy. That's a picture of the gospel. What part do you play? You're the one that's dead. So am I. It's a really critical understanding and I think a kind of approach to the idea of how I become saved. God had to come to me and he has to say, just like the Lazarus scenario, I am this dead guy, spiritually speaking. I'm in the tomb. God has to say to me, Greg Cash, live or I don't live. This is what all of chapter 2 is talking about. We could use the Gospel of John's further language and saying, he made me, regeneration, he made me a sheep. And because I'm a sheep, just like the Gospel of John says, I'll hear his voice and I'll respond. But that's nothing I can do. I can't will that to happen. I was dead, but God made me alive. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3 could be summarized this way: the mystery of the gospel. Now, you got to think again with me about how scandalous the gospel was in the first century. We got to try and get back into that time period, right? Because it's lost on us today, right? As I've said in the past, my seminary professors, one of the best gifts they ever gave me. They gave me many, but one of the best ones was they said, "You don't read the Bible with the tension." And it's so, that one statement really just resonated with me that from then on I tried to read the Bible with the tension of the Bible. When Jesus is being betrayed, do I feel the tension of the Garden of Gethsemane? No. Why? because I know what happens in a few days. But get back in the moment. Try to engage the text with your senses. Get in the moment. Change the whole way you read the scriptures. The gospel in the first century was scandalous. Why? Because Gentiles are being included. It doesn't even register with us today. But again, remember, all of the covenants from Abraham forward were about the Jewish people only. And here we are now. You can see why even people like Paul, who were persecuting this thing called Christianity. Why? Because it was corrupting Judaism in their mind. It was corrupting it. Why? Because it was changing what was handed down from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because they had such a tradition that was pushing this idea of what it had to be. Listen, you and I can read the Old Testament today. We can see it clearly. We can see the direct line right to Christ and Gentile inclusion. They couldn't. There was this elitism. By the way, we still struggle with that today. That's part of the human nature, for sure. But they were deep in it. And they could not see that Gentiles are being included. We don't even think about it today. It's open to all people groups. They struggled. The book of Acts describes it directly. They struggled. How do we include Gentiles in this thing? That doesn't even make sense. They're not the people of God. They're the dogs. But the whole point, the church, why it's this mystery is that God is bringing this one new man. There used to be two, Jew and Gentile. Now there's one new man combined, and they're going to be called the church. The church in the New Covenant era was always the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. The goal was always the nations. The nations were going to be blessed through Abraham, and Jesus came through that line and blessed the nations. It was a scandal, though. It was a mystery. It was one of the biggest hurdles that they were at. Now, chapter 4. Chapter 4 becomes a hinge point. This is challenging because all of chapters 1 through 3 are what we call the indicatives, meaning the facts of the Bible, the facts of this letter. He's going to be describing the things that are true of God, that are true of you, that are true of salvation, all these facts. And then 4 becomes this hinge point. It even starts with a therefore in chapter 4, verse 1. It becomes this hinge point into imperatives. So 1 through 3, indicatives. He's going to talk about the facts and the status of all things. And then if all of that's true, then in verse 1 of chapter 4, when he switches the discussion, he comes in and says, walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you were called. In other words, if all that's true, what I just got done unpacking for chapters 1 through 3, if all that's true, because of that, walk in a manner worthy of the calling, all those things. When you were brought to life, now walk accordingly. He starts unpacking all that, and then he starts giving commands. And we see that in the new covenant kind of world, let me jump into verse 11 of chapter 4 here. What does he see? What does he say here? He says, and he gave the apostles and prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers to equip saints for the work of the ministry. Okay. In the new covenant time, what did he do? When the church is being established, he gives apostles and prophets, and that's not abnormal. In fact, that's been historically exactly the way God has always done it. By the way, a bit of trivia, a little bit of Bible trivia for a second. No, it's actually, I take that back. It's not Bible trivia. Anybody know how many years it took to write the Old Testament? Off the top of your head? Yes, sir. 46. It's an incredibly particular guess. It's going to be quite a bit more than that. That would be less than that, actually. It's okay. Very close. Anywhere, there's debate, a little bit of debate, depends on several things, but let's say 800 to 1,000, give or take. Takes that long to write 39 books. Why? You understand what actually writing of the books was? It's not just people getting around going, hey, God wants me to write this book. I'm going to write this book. Whenever God does a covenant, he gives covenant documentation. Always. This is what happens all the time. He gives covenant documentation, and then he gives further spelling out. So when he's going to make a covenant, he brings people to write about that covenant and then show how they, like, for example, when Moses writes about the covenant blessings and curses, he then gives some history of Israel, and the other people come in and write, and what do they show? They show that those covenant curses were lived out. They show this is what happens when God warned them, but they were not faithful. And that happens over spans of centuries, because there was how many covenants in the Old Testament? 5. We have in the New Covenant, we have a few decades of writing, and all 27 books are done. All the New Covenant documentation is done. Why? We're dealing with one covenant. So he brings in the documentation. We have apostles and prophets. This is 4:11. He brings in apostles and prophets, just like he's done all the time. He's done these same kind of writers and unique people, and kind of positioned in history to do this crazy, unique, and man, if you think about it, really, what an honor it would be to be an author, if God specifically chose somebody in here to be a writer for him, that the nations would read. He gave these apostles and prophets, and they laid the foundation for the new covenant. They taught us, we're reading one of them today, they taught us this new covenant documentation. And then what happens? That generation starts to die off. He doesn't repeatedly give apostles and prophets. He does it like he's always done it, which is he sends in people to write, and then they die off. And what happens? That gets transitioned, and we see it here in 11, to evangelists, and then it says shepherds and teachers, which we would call pastors. So what's the point? What am I getting at here? I'm saying all of us stand on the foundation that the apostles and prophets have given us. That work gets transferred to evangelists. What does an evangelist do? He goes everywhere and he calls all people to Christ. My sheep hear my voice and they will respond. So we go and speak the master's words and the sheep will respond. And then where does the evangelist drive the people? Always the church. Always. That's the vehicle that God has for his people. And we see that here in 4:11. All right, now I want to look at today, 4:25. Let me read it again one more time. Very brief. I understand that's very brief. I want to talk to you today about lying. Believe it or not, this is a challenging discussion. I don't think this is an easy discussion. You might think in your head, like, oh, duh, lying's wrong. Well, we can close in prayer right now. That's easy. But the way that they describe it here, it's going to be a little bit more of a discussion. Here's what he says in 25, therefore put away falsehood, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we're all members of one body. I titled this Speaking the Truth in a World of Lies because I think this, I want to be serious with the text with you, and I want to think through just some things with you again. In one sense, we're supposed to put away falsehood, but some people have argued crazy things when it comes to the idea of lying. Is it ever, here's a kind of a question I've heard, is it ever okay for Christians to lie? Ever? Let me give you an example, and I've heard this one. You're hiding Jews, you live in the 50s or the 40s, I guess it is, the 40s in Nazi Germany, you're hiding Jews, and they come to the door and say, there are Jews in this house. Is it okay to lie? Heard people say, this is a little bit more of a fringe argument, that, listen, even camouflage is lying. I'm pretending to be a bush here as I hide from my enemies so that I can kill them before they kill me, and therefore I'm lying if I wear camouflage. That was bizarre. That was a bizarre one to me, but I've heard it. Is it ever okay to lie? Now listen, here's one of the, and I want to just be serious with the Bible. There are examples in the Bible of people who were lying. And I want to show you a couple of them. I just want to think with you here. Do we have examples in the Bible of people lying? Yes. Let me give you one. That's a famous one. Hebrew midwives. Exodus chapter 1. You don't have to turn there. I'm just going to read one little verse out of it. You know the story. Joseph brings all the people into Egypt. They do what they're supposed to do, be fruitful and multiply. This is the command from Genesis. And they multiplied like crazy, so much so that the Egyptians, and the Pharaoh specifically, says, man, these guys are everywhere. And if all it's going to take is one enemy to come in here turn these guys, the Hebrews, and we're done. So here's what we're going to do. Let's enslave them. But that doesn't work. Not enough, not to their degree that they want. So what do they say? Hey, Hebrew, which the irony is massive. It's not Egyptian midwives, it's Hebrew midwives. When you go to the Hebrew ladies that are giving birth, if it's a boy, kill it. And if it's a girl, let it live. And by the way, there's been some debate as to how they would have killed it. Obviously, if they would have just started murdering in the sense of violently, there would have probably been a major uprising. So they thought it was probably likely that they would strangle the baby boys and make it look like a stillborn. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. The text doesn't say it. But the point is the same. The Bible says that those Hebrew midwives feared the Lord. Pharaoh gets wind that it's not working, and he comes right to them and says, what is going on here? How come these women are still giving birth to baby boys? And here's what they say. Exodus 1:19, just in case you wondered. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they're vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. You want to be called vigorous as a woman? Probably, in this case. But listen, I don't care how vigorous you are. That's a lie. They're not killing those kids on purpose. How about another one? Joshua chapter 2. People are going to conquer the land. Moses has already died, and Joshua's taken over. They're going to conquer land. They're going into what main city first? Bible trivia? Excellent. Very good. Jericho. I heard over here too somewhere. Okay, so Jericho. They're going into Jericho, right? The whole march around the walls thing. Walls come tumbling down, if you know the song. So they're going to go to Jericho, and who do they go to? These spies, they're going to go and they're going to get their tactics, and they're going to get the lay of the land. They're going to figure out their approaches and how they're going to do this. And they go right to Rahab, right? This prostitute. And what do? They come in. She's terrified of them. And by the way, I find this always fascinating. She says, we're all afraid of you because we know what your God did to Egypt. She references Egypt. How many years is that? That's been 40 years ago, right? They've already wandered in the desert. We know what your God did. And here's what she makes the deal. Please, spare me. Right? As you're going to take this city, spare me, and I'll hide you, all that kind of stuff. But what does she do? Somehow word gets out that these two spies come into her house, and the Jericho people come to her and say, give us those men. And what does she say? Chapter 2, verse 4 in Joshua. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. And she said, true, the men did come to me, but I didn't know who they were and where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went, but pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. Thanks, Rahab. What's fascinating further, now this is not a Jewish person, but what's fascinating further is when you get into the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, the so-called heroes of the faith chapter, Rahab is listed. Specifically for this event. That's interesting. Here's what I find fascinating about this. In both of these examples, a lot of people go to these kinds of fringe examples, and they're very, very extreme. These are very, like 2 times in history this has happened, right? So these are very, very kind of outliers in terms of examples. In both of these examples, the lying was described, but it was never the focal point, ever. It wasn't like in the text, it was, we're so glad that she lied and did these things. It was never the focal point. It was described and then moved on. Always. But what I will say today, and this is what I want to focus on this morning or this afternoon, is there is an overwhelming biblical case. Overwhelming about those who lie. We must, as Christians, if you're a Christian in this room, listen, we cannot ever play with lying. So many people lie without even thinking about it, and I think even Christians struggle with this idea of being truthful without even thinking about it. We even say, some have even gone as far as to say, like it would be a beneficial thing. Sometimes it actually helps people by doing these things. We make up all these weird excuses. But listen, the Bible has a very different perspective about being falsehood, or lying. Lying is a big issue. In fact, it's such a big issue that the Bible has it as a heaven or hell issue. This is not small. Before we jump into 25, I just kind of pulled a few verses, right? So just listen. You don't have to turn. Just listen to these verses. I only grabbed 3. Proverbs 6:16 says this. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed blood. I just realized that I didn't put all 6 in there. Just put the first 3 because lying tongue is listed in there. That's Proverbs 6. Proverbs 12. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. By the way, the Lord detests. It's not that he's just not favorable in it. It's not that it's not the best option always. It is described as an abomination to him. He despises it. He hates it. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. And then the one that I had Aaron read this morning in Revelation 21. By the way, this is new heavens and new earth. So think of the positive and then the negative about what he's about to describe, the new heavens and the new earth. Here's what he says. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. That's the positive. Wow. And listen, Christians in the room, that's coming. That day is coming. You thought about these things. But then he goes into the negative. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars. Like that's listed with murderers. We don't think like this in our culture. The sexually immoral, the murderers, and liars. We definitely separate those two. God doesn't. All liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Do you hear the language? There's a reservation for those people. And it's in the second death, this lake of fire. See, the New Testament writers, right, they're standing on this Old Testament theology of how God views these things. And so they write. They see this direct connection between what your mouth says and how that's connected to your heart. And with those who practice falsehood, they go to hell. You can't get more serious than these things. Now let's look at our verse. 25 says this, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we're members one of another. Now, whenever we see the therefore, right, we have to say, what is he talking about? What has he been referencing? And what do we have? We know that he's been walking through not to walk like Gentiles in the terms of the spiritual nature of those things, right? And I think 25 is directly referencing 22, to put off your old self. I think that's the point. That's the therefore. So we are 22, to put off our old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires. And then we jump to 25. Therefore, because you see the same language, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. Okay? We are to put those things off, that old self. Why? Because that's what we've inherited in Adam. That's who Adam was, right? That's what you did when you were dead. That's the point. That's the way you lived when you were dead, but God's made you alive. Christians, chapter 2. Those things have to be put off. And I think 22, the verse 22, really unpacks where lies come from. And I want to think with you on this. I think it says here right at the end of this verse here that these our old self, which I think is what the lying, this falsehood is connected to, that old self. Where does that old self and lies come from? It comes from deceitful desires, right? That is the main point. But listen, our hearts, we've said this before, are desire factories, and that's fine. That's not the issue. Your heart does nothing but create desires. That by itself is not the problem. The problem is we always want the things that we're not supposed to want. Our desires are not for the things of God. Adam, if you think about it, Genesis 1 and 2, he was created as an innocent desirer. Desires aren't the problem. Adam, when he was in full desire before Genesis 3, he always desired the things of God. But what happened? Listen, if you think about what God created, sexual desire is good. That's not the problem. Desires for life, desires for family, desires for hope in a future, desire for all these things, those are all good. That's not the problem. What's wrong is when we go after those things in the wrong way. And that's the issue. This is the falsehood. Adam, when he takes part in the mutiny, what does he do? Sin was introduced, and desires fell along with the world. This is what happens. So now what happens? Our desires are only and always in opposition to God. That's our problem. Desires aren't the problem. The fact that we have deceitful desires. That's now the problem. Our desires lie to us. If we were in line with God, if we were walking in step with God in perfect relationship, listen, we would be chasing the desires of God, and we would do it with passion. That's not the problem. The problem is our desires are still rooted in Adam, even though for those of us in the room that have been freed from sin, we still have this holding on effect of these deceitful desires. And they lie to us, and they tell us that not only what we want, but the best way to get them. And it's nothing but a lie. I want to look at, really quickly, motivations for lying. I want to turn, this is where Matthew 21. Let's jump to Matthew really quickly. And I think that it coincides. I don't usually like to jump out of the book that we are in, but I think that this it's just kind of an analogy with the story of Jesus, and it's kind of perfect for what we've been saying here in Ephesians 4. In Matthew chapter 21, Jesus has been doing some crazy things, right? So one of the things that he's been doing, the chapter starts with the triumphal entry. He's had these kind of cataclysmic encounters with the religious elites in Jerusalem, and he's doing all these things. He goes and cleanses the temple and clears it, and then he leaves and goes to Bethany in chapter 21, and then he comes back to Jerusalem, and he gets right into a head-on engagement with the religious leaders. Now, what I want to argue this afternoon, is, I can't get past that, I'm sorry. What I want to talk about is this idea of what motivates us to lie. And I think we're going to see that exact picture here in chapter 21 with this encounter in 23 through 27. And I think that it's twofold. I'll tell you right up front. I think that the two reasons that we lie, probably not the only, but the two that we're going to see in this passage, is fear of man and a desire for personal comfort. Okay, let me just see if I can make my case to you. Let's read 21. We're going to read 23 to 27 really quickly. So, when he entered the temple, and the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching, he said, and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered them, "I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man?" And they discussed it amongst themselves, and saying, "If we say from heaven, he'll say to us, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say from man, we're afraid of the crowd, for they hold that John was a prophet." And so they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Now, I heard one theologian call this the swine test, which I thought was interesting, the pig test. What does he mean? Jesus has said earlier, Matthew 7, that I'm not going to throw my pearls before pigs, right? This is not what you do. He's discerning what level of who he's going to, how he's going to interact with this group here. And so I want to just kind of take it line by line here really quickly and see this. Because here's the thing. If you are living in falsehood, and I think this is what we're going to see. If you are living in falsehood, okay? Now, what does that mean? I think that means if you are a person who calculates their words, right, in such a way to conceal. If that's you, I think the point of what he's saying here in the pig test is that you are cutting yourself off from Jesus. He will not deal with you in this way. This is what we see here. Jesus is fine with dealing with prostitutes, by the way, tax collectors, sinners. Those people are wicked, and they know they're wicked. They know that they need a Savior. But these other groups, what we'll call pigs for all intents and purposes, in the gospel, are those who think that they're good. Who think that, you know what, I know that I'm not perfect, that's for sure, but I know I'm not the worst either. I'm kind of this, I'm pretty okay. It's what the Gospels would describe as, in Jesus' own mouth, they don't know that they need a doctor. They call themselves the healthy. And Jesus is not going to deal with them. You've got to remember that Jesus, especially to us Christians, has not called us to behavior modification. He's not saying just do better stuff. He's calling us to come and die. I think that's the point. But let me look at these two motivations here. I think fear of man is the first one. Let's see this in 21, verse 25. Jesus answered them, I'm going to start in 24. Jesus answered them, I will also ask you one question. I'll tell you this answer. And if you answer me, then I'll tell you what authority I did this from. 25. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man? And they discussed it among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he'll say to us, why do you believe him then? See the arguments here? It's not something that we naturally deal with, but they go into this little huddle. Okay? Jesus poses a question because they're arguing at the periphery level, which, by the way, I know that we do all the time. He gets right to the root of the issue. No, we're not going to talk about the stuff you want to talk about. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's get at John. And what's the real heart of the matter? You guys are all liars. You don't care about truth. And he displays that. So they go into this little huddle, and what do they say? Can't answer that way. Because, why? Because it's not true? Pigs never care about the truth. You understand? People who are liars never care about the truth. They're not seeking truth. They want to keep their versions of what that truth is. Liars don't care. The fact that these guys go into this huddle in verse 25 and say, if we say it's from heaven, he's going to say to us, why didn't you believe him? In other words, we can't say that because he's going to back us into a corner that we don't have an answer for. We don't want to look foolish. And then he does the second view. I think what you're seeing in 25 automatically is that these people are living in this calculated way of protecting the way that people view them. You ever struggle with that in lying? If I was too honest, people might think I'm here. Can't have that. I need people to think highly of me. That's what we're seeing right here. Fear of man, I need to be made much of. It's a significant problem. So they go, well, we can't say that, even though it's true, right? We can't say that, even though many think it's true. They don't think it's true, but we can't say that because he's going to back us into a corner. What about fear of personal comfort? I think that's a bigger issue, 26. But, so this is the second option, but if we say, from man, right? In other words, John's baptism had zero spiritual significance. It was just something that they did. If we say it's from man, we're afraid of the crowd, for they all hold John as a prophet. In other words, my comfort will be disrupted. Why don't they just say it? That's what they really believe. They don't believe John's baptism had any significance. They don't care about those things. Why not just say it? They're afraid. They're afraid because their lives are going to be disrupted, and their lives would change too much if they were that honest. Listen, millions and millions and millions of lies are born every single day from these two fears. I need to, I think, notice that these two desires keep everyone happy with me or my own comfort. They are deceitful. Listen, Satan was in this huddle with these guys. When they go back and they say, okay, let's figure out an answer here, Satan's right there. Have you ever heard that voice? Listen, you can't come in and say, don't take a hard line here, because he's going to get you if you say this. So, stay in the center. Stay diplomatic. You can't be too harsh or you can't be too soft. You got to just go middle of the road so that life doesn't get altered too much. Just kind of stay safe. That's Satan's voice, man. That's the father of lies right there. And it's happening in this little huddle that we're describing right here. And it happens to this day. You ever heard this voice? I have. It's a lie, and the reason why it's deceitful is because we think that people, what they think of us, is more important than how God values His truth. What people think will matter more than what God thinks about truthfulness and what God thinks. That's the deceitful lie. I think when we see how a lie is born like that in Matthew 21, we see why Paul will come at this and say, therefore, put away falsehood. This cannot be true of Christians. That's how the world is. We have this phrase that we say all the time at CRBC, and that is, if it's true of them, may it never be true of us. Right? If the world has to lie, because that's what the world does, may it never be true of us. We've been called out of that. That's who we were, not who we are. Don't fall back into such things. If Paul were here this morning, what would he say to us? You ever thought about how crazy it is that you're reading somebody else's mail? That's how they describe these letters. Ephesians is just somebody else's mail, and you're reading it. If Paul came in here this morning or this afternoon and said, listen, that's my letter. I have a message for CRBC. He had a message for Ephesus. What would he say? Ever thought about such things? I think at minimum he would say, if you're struggling with falsehood, put that away. You've got to put all this away. This cannot be amongst the people of God. If it's true of the world, may it never be true of us. We've been called out of that. We have to get rid of our old self, especially when it comes to the church of God. Look around. You've been called as a family. A church is that. It's not how our culture views it, but that's what the church was always designed to be. It was a family. You are called to be the people of God. Church has been viewed now as like a buffet drive-through. It's like, see if you have anything I want, and if you don't, then I'll move on. You stay on the periphery of a church like that, you're not a part of any church. You sit in a room. That's not what the church is. You sit in the room and hear a talk, and not even a very good talk. You know what I mean? You just kind of sit in a room and you just hear. But this is not what the church is. This is just a meeting of the family. And what has to be true of a family that has been bought by Christ, brought out of that old self, brought into new life, what has to be true of us is truth. Like if I speak to you, you should never have to question if I have ulterior motives. Like you can't believe what I'm telling you. Like I will always be honest with you no matter what, even if it makes me look bad. By the way, pastors struggle with this a lot. You know, one of the biggest struggles that I've seen in the pastoral world, saying I don't know to a Bible question. So they give some phony answer. You know what that's called? Lying, deception, spitting out stuff, hoping that something sticks. It's pride. Can't be true of us. We're a family. I want to close with just this thought. The world is desperate for authenticity. They have deceitful desires. They're looking in all different places. They're looking to everywhere except for the God who made them. And should God not rescue them, they will be judged by God. Revelation 21 is very clear on that. But in this room too, we're looking for authenticity. And if we've been rescued, and we've been called as the people of God, then we have to put away falsehood. I don't know your struggles. I don't know your individual struggles. I know that you do struggle with it. I know that that portion of Adam is still hanging on in you, just like me. Put it away. If you've been saved in this room. If you're not saved in this room, I would call you to repentance immediately. This is not a get-out-of-jail-free card in the sense of only talking to Christians. If you're not a Christian in this room, repent and believe. But if you're the people of God in this room and you've been purchased, put all these things away. Be done with it. If you need to make amends because you've been a liar, do that. Especially with the people of God. I love it how it ends this verse, right? When it talks about the last bit, the last thing I'll say. Sorry, I already shut my Bible. That's like a rookie mistake. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. And then it gives the reason. For we're members of one of another. Wow, let me read that actually. It says, for we are members one of another. We're a family. That's the reason. We've been bought. We're one new man. Truth matters. The Bible views truth as a heaven or hell issue. It's very critical. And we know this, that it starts in the house of God. So where are you at this morning? Where are you at with this idea of falsehood? You struggling? Wherever you are, get rid of those things. It starts here with the people of God.